Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our seventh iteration of this monthly webinar series that we run called India and Asia. This series aims to unpack India's changing position as a rising power in Asia. In particular, it asks what kind of roles can India play, and more importantly, what kind of roles do other countries want India to play in the region as a constructive actor. We have so far discussed India's relations with Maldives, with Philippines, Japan, ASEAN, Malaysia, and last month we did one on the Middle East in context of the Iran war. And today we are discussing the India-US strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific, which is a topic that I really wanted to discuss for many months now. What this session is not is discussing India-US bilateral relations, which is a vast topic, and we have been discussing it for many months now because of the tariff standoff. This is specifically to talk about India-US strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific. And, because at least on paper, that still remains the primary engine of why this relationship exists, right? I mean, even now, if you look at the Trump White House national security strategy that was published in 2025, it still says that one of their goals is to encourage New Delhi to play a greater role in the Indo-Pacific security. So what does that exactly mean? That broad sentence, what does that exactly mean? How we can unpack it? That's what this session is about. And I'm hoping that specifically a few questions that we can touch upon in this session. One is that if the Indo-Pacific is the main arena of partnership, why is it that we see so much more cooperation in other arenas, in tech, in economics, in supply chains, in international institutions, but we see very little actual cooperation going on in the hard security of several Indo-Pacific regions. So we see some cooperation in the Middle East, but when it comes to, say, Indian Ocean islands, to the best of my knowledge, there is not much that is happening between US and the United States. And in the East Asia, in ASEAN, again, there is limits. There is Quad, but Quad is, of course, bedeviled by all sorts of problems. But there's, if India starts a strategic partnership with the Philippines, it's not like US is involved in that in some way, midwife, or had some role to play. It is a very independent um, in the whole. It's a very independent strategic push that India is carrying out, which seems to be not really aligned with the United States or what the United States wants. And the second question that I would like to also raise is that strategic partnership is unique in itself because it's not an alliance, and that's very unique for uncharacteristic for United States. United States historically likes alliance, and this was a very specific model that Bush era United States experimented with, which was a more loose cooperation to bring India into its orbit, and something that they were experimenting with in certain ways. And that was conceived at a time when the international environment was very different. In Bush era, the United States hoped to actually maintain a very good relationship with China. Today, China and United States are locked in this rivalry, which is in some ways becoming, irreparable. In some ways, like the rift is becoming irreparable. In that circumstance, is a loose cooperation, like a loose arrangement like this, a strategic partnership, still works? Or it has to be replaced by alliance, otherwise it doesn't work in the way United States think about its strategy. And the third I wanted to just raise is that the historical argument has been that United States has preferred to use carrots rather than sticks with India. It uses what it calls strategic altruism. I mean, there are all sorts of problems with that term, whether that actually was altruistic or not, but there is that idea that there is going to be a soft approach towards India. And that seems to have appended in the last 1 year. And there has been much more coercive and much more use of reliance on sticks rather than carrots when dealing with India. And it has also it has also yielded results. There have been some things that Washington wanted out of India, which it has managed to get while being coercive. Does this mean that there is going to be going forward some kind of readjustment in the way the tactics are used of how we get India to do what we want? Right. So these are some of the issues that I want to flag. Others I will definitely raise during the question answer session. But to discuss these issues with us, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Azan Tarapur with us. He's a research scholar at the Stanford University. He is currently also visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and visiting fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. from where he's joining us. His research focuses on military strategy, India defense policy, and Indo-Pacific security issues. And he previously held research position in he held a teaching position in the U.S. Army War College and in several think tanks in Australia, in India, and in the United States. Before that, before getting into scholarly career, spent 13 years in the Australian Defence Ministry. He has a PhD from King's College and MSc from LSE. And he's also a very important voice in talking about and advocating for India-US strategic partnership in the American policy circles. A few years ago, I don't know if everybody remembers, but Washington started this new cycle of whether the strategic partnership with India is worth it, which they do every few years. And this time it was triggered by this article that came out in Foreign Affairs called America's Bad Bet on India. And the rebuttal to that was written by Arzan, who wrote that it is America's best bet in the Indo-Pacific. So who better to talk about this topic? So welcome, Arzan. I'll hand it over to you. Tanuja will take over the slides, and then we will come back once your remarks are over. After that, we will switch to question and answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sandeep. While you get the slides up, I'll just say what Sandeep didn't say is that he and I have known each other for over a decade. Go back. He and I have known each other for over a decade. When I was fresh out of government service and I was starting down the lonely path of PhD study, Sandeep was one of the people who I met in Delhi and who I leaned upon and asked lots and lots of stupid questions. And he was kind enough to hold my hand. He was already a master researcher at that point. And so he was kind enough to hold my hand through my initial sort of forays, my initial entry into this field. So thank you very much, Sandeep, for your help throughout the years. Thank you to NUS and for this webinar series. It's very exciting to be here. I think Singapore is one of those, if not the greatest center of India study outside of India. It certainly ranks in the very top tier. So thanks very much. It's a privilege. You've heard from Sandeep that I am both previously in government and now in academia. I'm a strategic analyst, right? I am not a psychologist. And what we have learned, I think, in the past year is that understanding the US and what the US wants in any field from any country requires not only strategic analysis, but nowadays also bloody psychological analysis. And so there is a big caveat to everything that I'm going to say, obviously. But I do think, it is my job to be a strategic analyst. It is my job to try and look through the haze. And I think we are now starting to see the rough outlines of what a Trumpian strategic direction is to this strategic partnership that Sandeep was talking about. I'll touch on some of the questions that you raised in your intro, Sandeep. I probably won't answer them adequately, and I'm happy to pursue them in the Q&A. But I think we'll touch on many of them. Can I have the next slide, please? When we talk about what Washington wants from India, the first most important point to make is that India obviously matters, right? And we know this. Everyone on this webinar knows that India inherently, intrinsically matters. It matters because of its economic size, because of its demographic size, because of its civilizational nature, etc., right? Its inherent importance makes India matter to the United States. And the United States has woken up to this several decades ago. And as Sandeep alluded to, there are certainly cycles of waking up to it and forgetting it, and then waking up to it again and forgetting it. But the first most important reason why India matters and what the US wants from it is to engage with the world's most populous country, its fourth biggest economy, its second biggest military, one of the main giants of Asia, right? So as you can see from these weighted maps in terms of GDP and especially in terms of population, and as we'll discuss in terms of geography as well, India is unignorable, right? You cannot ignore the biggest country in the world. Next slide, please. We also know that specific to the United States, India matters for a range of reasons. We know that there is a very large and disproportionately, even as large as the Indian diaspora is in the United States, it is disproportionately more influential than even its large size would suggest. And I mean that especially in terms of the leading sectors of the US economy and therefore the global economy, but also increasingly in politics, right? There's a picture, if people can make out those faces on the left-hand side, that is the extended family of the Vice President of the United States. The pictures in the middle are some of the captains of American industry, who are all desis. And on the right-hand side, we've seen how Indian immigration to the US, which has heretofore or until very recently been a very sort of uncontroversial issue, has increasingly also become politicized. So for the US in particular, right, and I know we're not going to talk about bilateral relationship in great detail, but it's worth noting that for the US in particular, India matters for many reasons. Right? Not only because it's inherently big, not only because of the diaspora, not only because of the economic relationship that the US has, but for many, many reasons. Next slide, please. I am, however, going to ignore all of that. Sandeep has instructed me to ignore all of that bilateral gumph, and we're only going to focus on the underlying strategic rationale for this relationship. We're going to focus on the strategic partnership today. I would argue, and I think it's a defensible position, that the strategic partnership, the defense partnership between the US and India, has been the leading edge, the leading sector of their partnership, of their relationship overall, since at least the 1990s. In the Cold War, it was a little bit different, but since at least the post-Cold War days, defense has been the leading sector of the relationship. And even though the subsequent decades, so after 9/11, after the civil nuclear deal, and after the relationship became deeper and broader, more comprehensive, I would argue that the strategic partnership was always the leading edge of it. And to add evidence to that, in the past year or so, since the Trump rupture in the bilateral relationship, as I'll discuss at greater length later, I would suggest that this strategic partnership, the defense partnership, remains the most important and the most inviolable part of this bilateral relationship, of this strategic relationship. Next slide, please. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I'll quickly skate over some of the historical trajectory to show you how we've gotten to where we are. Then I'll spend some time talking about what has been, as Sandeep said, the core policy of the United States towards India for at least the past quarter century. Let's say approximately the last quarter century, since the turn of the century. This idea of strategic altruism. I will sort of I'll explain what that meant for American expectations of India and what it meant for America as the assumptions underlying American policy. And then we'll come to the present day and we'll see how the Trump rupture has upended that policy or not, because there are, of course, some similarities to previous policies. And I'll conclude a little bit with what this means for the region. As you heard, my background, even though I am now in the US, my earlier professional background was in Australia. You are in Singapore, and what happens between the US and India matters for countries like Australia and Singapore. It is critical for regional order and regional stability. So I think we should also address that. Okay, so let's begin. Let's go next slide, please, to the history. The US-India relationship has really, really rocketed in the past, again, quarter century or so. And this trajectory is important. It's important to understand how quickly and how far this relationship, the strategic partnership came. Right? There is a long history of the bilateral relationship, reaching right back to the days of India's founding, right? We know that the US Constitution was part of the inspiration for the Indian Constitution. We know that during the early Cold War days in the 50s and 60s, Nehruvian India looked to the United States, despite non-alignment and despite its sort of anti-colonial stance, it still looked to the United States as a source of development assistance and indeed strategic assistance in 1962. But we also know that the relationship had a real low point starting in 1971, in the 70s. When Indira Gandhi went to Washington in the lead up to the 71 war, she was met with a famously icy reception from President Nixon, who was was both racist and misogynistic. And so when he's confronted with an urbane female leader from the global South, obviously he's not gonna know how to handle that. And so we go from that low point of thinly disguised hostility from the United States towards India to a radical turnaround after the Cold War, a radical turnaround. We see a rapprochement between the US and India that began in the 1990s, was briefly interrupted by the Indian nuclear tests in 98, but was quickly, like in historical terms, very quickly patched up after the US levied sanctions. So quickly, in fact, that within a decade, we went from sanctions to the ratification of the US-India civil nuclear deal. Now, this was not just for this. This has become, I think, pretty well understood, but just for the sake of underscoring how important this one deal was, it was not only a technical agreement about civil nuclear power. It was the removal of the key obstacle in their strategic relationship, right? Until this deal happened sort of in 2005 and 2008, until then, the Indian nuclear program was the key stumbling, and the US policy towards it was the key stumbling block in their partnership. So when they struck this deal, and that's the photo in the middle, it cleared the decks and cleared the way for a rapid improvement in the relationship. And we saw the emergence at that time, in that decade, of this policy of strategic altruism, which I'll explain in a second. And not only strategic altruism, but by the time of the Biden administration, on the right here, it went even beyond strategic altruism to what I assessed was the emergence of a US policy that sought greater interdependence between India and the US. I think that was a driving rationale for a lot of those strategic adjacent policies that the US was pursuing. So when we talk about space and technology innovation and defense industrial base integration, those strategic adjacent initiatives were designed, I think, to develop interdependence. So what we see in sum overall, when you look at this historical trajectory, from a low point in the 1970s to a sort of the beginnings of a relationship at the turn of the century to a real move towards deep interdependence until last year. All right, which is in historical terms extremely fast. And not to toot my own horn, but my graphics skills are really pretty excellent when you consider this evolution captured in these graphics. When you see the distance between the two principles on the left, the center, and the right, it really does capture how the relationship evolved over those decades. So, if that's the trajectory and if that's the sort of policy this century, what is the US rationale? What is it that the US wants? Next slide, please. It is what we've talked about today, something called strategic altruism. The logic of this policy, let's just set aside whether you like the term or not, because there are sort of connotations to that term. But setting that aside, there were serious thinkers on both sides, in the US and in India, people like Ashley Teller, C. Raja Mohan, who put serious intellectual foundations behind this policy. And the core idea, the core goal behind this policy of strategic altruism was for the United States to prevent any country from attaining hegemony in Asia. And of course, we're talking about China, right? This policy of strategic altruism towards India was driven fundamentally by a US policy that for decades, since the Second World War, has opposed any country from achieving anything resembling hegemony on the Eurasian landmass. So obviously we know that there was in the first half of the 20th century, it's what historians used to call the German problem, right? That Germany was just too big and would dominate Europe and therefore Eurasia. In the Cold War, it was the problem of the Soviet Union, and US policy through containment was designed to prevent Soviet hegemony over Eurasia. In the post-Cold War world, China has been the putative possible potential hegemon of Eurasia. And US policy has been to prevent, as I said, throughout the 20th century, to prevent any country achieving hegemony in Eurasia, which in the 21st century really meant counterbalancing China's rise. Again, I use that term advisedly, counterbalancing, not containing, but counterbalancing China's rise. And this was the foundation of US policy for decades. And it found expression when it comes to US policy towards India in this idea of strategic altruism. The idea is that if the United States can buttress Indian power, build Indian power, then that will be inherently good for US interests. The US does not need to be closely aligned with Indian policy, or the other way around. Indian policy does not need to be closely aligned with US interests for this to work. All that is required for this policy to work is that India becomes powerful. Because the underlying assumption is that India and China have intrinsically, structurally divergent national security interests. And so any power that India accrues will necessarily wind up being a structural limitation to Chinese power and a structural impediment to Chinese hegemony, putative Chinese hegemony. And that's the underlying rationale behind strategic altruism. And so what that means as a policy prescription for Washington is that we in the US will keep helping India, quote unquote, even without any immediate return on investment, right? And so you do see the US offering India significant policy concessions. And I think this is true. There were significant policy concessions. First and foremost with the civil nuclear deal, right? The US completely undid decades of its own non-proliferation policy to accommodate Indian interests. And then on top of that, of course, there was a whole range of access to US technology, access to US convening power, and the US really facilitating, encouraging, and paving the way for a larger Indian role in the Indo-Pacific. All of those things, I think, are defensible characterizations of the US as providing concessions to India. And moreover, doing it without any expectation of reciprocity, without any expectation that India will necessarily provide clear and immediate benefits to the US. So that was the idea behind strategic altruism. But what does it mean? What is it when we get to the nuts and bolts? What does the US actually want from India, or not even want from India, but what does the US expect that India will do? When we say that a powerful India will be structurally opposed to China or structurally divergent from China, what does that actually mean? I'm glad you asked. Next slide, please. I think, as I said, there is no expectation of reciprocity from New Delhi, but there was an expectation that India, of its own volition and for its own reasons, for its own national security reasons, will do certain things. Number one, first and foremost, rests on India's geographic position. The fact that India dominates the Indian Ocean rim, the Indian Ocean region, means that India, and given India's sort of intrinsic national power, means that India will dominate the IOR, the Indian Ocean region, and do so in a way, reaching right back to the ideas of Paneker, that it will do so in a way that aligns with US principles of freedom of navigation across the Indian Ocean, right? So number one is the idea that India is a force for good in the Indian Ocean region. Number two is this idea about India having aligned interests on many contingencies. Now, this reaches way back right to 1991 when there was talk that did not, of course, materialize of India supporting in some way the US Gulf War against Iraq in 91. But it also reaches right up to the possible future war against China over Taiwan, and debates within the Beltway, within the US, over what India would do in such a contingency. Now, I think, of course, it's laughable that India would provide any sort of direct military assistance in and around the central theater of Taiwan, but there is still a very live question of what role India would play as a supporting actor or as an independent but aligned of its own interest actor in such a contingency. This is an open question. In any future general and protracted war that the US has with China, the Indian policy will make a difference. A third factor is this idea of technology innovation and defense industrial base, right? As I said earlier, in the previous administration, I think there was a concerted move to integrate the US and Indian high-tech sectors on leading technologies, and not just sort of open doors to each other, but actually create interdependencies. And so you had initiatives like ISET, which has now been renamed Trust, initiatives like IndusX, which were all designed not only, as I said, to open doors, but to actually make it so that the two ecosystems were integrated in an almost irreversible way. And the final expectation of what India would do is that a powerful India would, again, of its own volition and for its own interests, it would be an important and positive actor in regional order, in stabilizing the region, in being a status quoist power in not only South Asia, but across the Indian Ocean region. All right, and so this is in this category of issues, we see the US forging a close relationship with India through the Quad, especially, which was an attempt by those four countries, the US, India, Japan, and Australia, to provide a cooperative and positive vision for the Indo-Pacific that stands essentially as a bulwark against Chinese coercion. And so there was a sense that, for its own reasons, India would play a role as a geopolitical actor in any sort of wartime contingency or crisis, as a technology actor, and as a defender of and a promoter of regional order. This is what the US expected from India, right, from its policy of strategic altruism. My question to you, for you to ponder, is how did India perform on these factors, on these issues? What did India do for the US, right? From Americans' point of view. Of course, the things that I've just talked about were, as I said, not done for the US, but how were Indian actions seen by both policymakers and critics in Washington? The fact is that when you talk about strategic altruism, remember I said there is no immediate ROI, right? There is no immediate benefit to the US. And the fact is that every argument And I've made these arguments, right? I'm guilty of this. Every argument in favor of the US-India strategic partnership was framed in the future tense, not in the past tense of what India has done to do all of these things, not even in the present tense, but in the future tense. India will be this. India will do that, right? When you actually look at the record, the empirical record of what India has done on these four lines, it's a pretty scant empirical record, right? People in India will talk about, well, arms transfers from the US to India were very high. Yes, that's true, but that is not a favor that the US was doing to India. No, correction, that is not a favor that India was doing for the US, right? Buying American equipment would please mercantilist leaders like Trump, but until Trump came along, this was not something that India did as a favor to the US. These are things that India did to build its own military capability because it knew that the US equipment was the state of the art. It did not, of course, help with the sorts of military deterrence that the US would have wished it did when it came to China. And the most damaging problem was the revelations that came circa 2023 of India's attempt to kill Pannu. Now, this was, just one incident, right? But it came at a time in the second half of it was made public in November of 2023. But in fact, US law enforcement was working this issue in the summer of 2023. If you cast your mind back to the summer of 2023, that was Modi's state visit to Washington, when there was a slew of very big and impressive sounding deliverables and deals struck, including the provision of technology transfer for the GE F414 engines, et cetera, the Artemis Accords, et cetera. All of those big high-level state visit deliverables were happening at the same time that US law enforcement had discovered that Indian intelligence agencies were trying to kill an American citizen in America. Now, that was just a totemic example, one clear crystallized example of where the US saw it providing concessions, as they would frame it, as the US state would frame it, providing concessions to India with access to jet engine technology, which not many countries have, at the same time that Indian intelligence services are trying to kill Americans on American soil. And so you see, I would argue, the beginnings of this fragmentation, this fracturing of trust at that time in 2023. And you see mounting distrust in the US system from then on. Okay, next slide, please. As this is happening, let's just sort of put our scholarly hats on and say, for strategic altruism to work, what would be required? Strategic altruism would work as a policy as long as there was a reasonable expectation that India had prospects for growth, both economic growth as an underpinning to, most importantly, strategic growth as a strategic actor in the Indian Ocean region. Secondly, as long as India had a bias for defending the status quo. And I think both of those assumptions were mostly good assumptions. India continues to grow. It's the fastest growing major economy for several years now. And it is more or less a status quoist power. And they're reasonably well-founded assumptions. And then there was an assumption that was, until recently, much more firm, a much more solidly grounded assumption, which was that the US would have an interest in continuing the policy it has had for decades of engineering a balance of power on the Eurasian landmass. And ironically, that assumption about US interests in Eurasia, which until 12 months ago I would have thought was the most solid of these three assumptions, actually proved to be the weakest assumption, the one that was first proven false. India continues to grow, and I think and hope it will continue to grow. India continues to be a status quo power, and I think and hope it will continue to be. But the US the consistent pattern of US policy that has favored a balance of power on the Eurasian landmass is now no longer so sure. So what we have, next slide, please, is the Trump rupture. And I would argue the demise of strategic altruism. We know what the rupture was. Sandeep mentioned that we've spoken about it at length already. There was the contention over how Operation Sindoor, the May conflict, ended. There was the imposition of tariffs, the imposition of more tariffs, the discussion of H-1Bs, the name calling, et cetera, right? So we know what happened last year. My argument is that what we have seen as the dust has begun to settle from that rupture is that the relationship now has, I would argue, the way I would characterize it, the relationship now has a lower ceiling, meaning that we will not return to the days of pre-Trump strategic partnership between the US and India. That move towards interdependence that I was talking about, that move towards a comprehensive strategic partnership cloaked in sort of soothing shibboleths of, common values and democratic this and that, all of that is gone. Trust is gone. The ceiling is now lower. Remember, I mean, Indians have lectured me on the 1971 deployment of the USS Enterprise. All right, something that took place half a century ago. The rupture that we saw in 2025 will linger with us for decades. So the ceiling is lower. We're not going back to how it was, despite the fact that we've seen a cavalcade of senior level visits, right? Just last week, Foreign Secretary Misri was in Washington. We've heard that Sextate Rubio will be going to India next month. Last month, we had Elbridge Colby, essentially the defense policy chief of the US. We had the Deputy Secretary of State go to Raisina. We had the commander of Indo-Pacific visit India. We've had all these senior level visits happen just in the last couple of months as the US and India have tried to patch up their relationship after this rupture. Right? And there has been a lot of patching up done, but the ceiling is much lower than it was. At the same time that the ceiling is lower, I would argue that the floor is higher. Right? No longer will we go back to the bad old days of the 1970s or 80s of really frosty relationships between these two countries, because the connections between these two countries over the past quarter century have been institutionalized. And so even in the darkest days of the rupture last year, we saw the US and India continue, for example, with UWS, the army exercise. We saw them continue their 2+2 intersessional meetings. We saw them continue a range of Quad working group meetings. All of this work continues, right? This is institutionalized. So even though the trust at the apex, at the political level, is degraded, the institutional bureaucratic relationship continues. So lower ceiling, higher floor. And we see this sort of clawing back of normalcy. But the big, as I said earlier, as I said at the outset, what we're starting to see is, as the dust is settling, the emergence of the outlines of US policy towards India. And the core theme I would posit to you, as we've seen strategic altruism, the sort of unconditional support of India, as we've seen that recede into the background, what we've seen is the emergence of conditionality in American policy. We will support you, right? Elbridge Colby said this last month when he was in India. We will support you. We do support the rise of Indian power as long as it suits our interests. As long as it suits our interests. When Landau, the DepSec state, was in India for Raisina, he said, we don't want to see India become another China. Right? I mean, this is a ridiculous notion, but this is the type of idea that has set boundaries and limits to American approaches to India. And so Colby's speech last month set out what I think is the beginnings of a strategic logic post-strategic altruism. Next slide, please. He called it, in line with the NSS, he called it flexible realism, right? We've gone from strategic altruism to flexible realism, which is a general term for US policy in the NSS, not specific to India. But under this, let's compare the two. Under this idea, let's compare where we are now with where we were under strategic altruism. Whereas the goal with strategic altruism was balance of power, prevent Asian hegemony, the goal here is to gain clear benefits to the US. They have to be visible, they have to be measurable, they have to be tangible, immediate, clear benefits to the US, right? This is what people talk about transactionalism. I think it's more than transactionalism. I think it's transactionalism that is bounded in time and space and type. Secondly, when we talk in strategic altruism that, a powerful India is good for the US, that is still the case. Colby said it very, very explicitly and repeatedly. A powerful India is good for the US. But he said not only is alignment not necessary, as was the case in strategic altruism, but he, in fact, went so far as to say, we will not agree on everything. There will be many things that we disagree on. So not only is alignment not necessary, but now under this new policy that's emerging slowly, it's not even expected. We expect to see divergences. And finally, therefore, if we don't agree on something, no longer will we, the US, keep providing concessions on this sort of indeterminate, unspecified future long-term ROI, but rather now American support for India is conditional on India pursuing certain policies. Now, that's not to say that the US is coercing India to pursue certain policies. Elbridge Colby was pretty clear that the US would not do that. But I say it's conditional to mean that the US will support India in certain ways, at certain times, for certain things. No longer is there a blank check. And we see this in the trade deal, right? Or the deal to make a trade deal, whatever we call it, that was announced in February. The US is no longer going to provide concessions to India universally, as it tried to do for the past quarter century. But now there is an expectation that the US will only support Indian power when it suits the US. This is quite a change from strategic altruism. Next slide, please. So when we talk about those specific expectations of Indian behavior, much of it is still actually there, but the tone and the emphasis is different, right? When we talk about geography or India's geopolitical position in the IOR, that's broadly still similar, but with a few tweaks. So we saw, as with the sinking of the Dana, that the US will not necessarily defer to India as the net security provider in the region. The US will still just pursue its own interests, even in the IOR. When we talk about contingencies, I mean, I still don't think there was ever a real expectation that India would contribute directly to a contingency in the first island chain in the Western Pacific. But increasingly, it seems that the Trump administration will demand something. Whenever it goes to war, it will demand something of its allies and partners. Whereas previously, under the Biden administration, there was much more latitude and much less pressure on countries like India to do things. Those days are gone. There will now be an expectation that India does something visible. We talk about tech and defense industrial base integration. That still remains an important part, an important pillar of American policy. But I think the emphasis is increasingly on defense industrial production rather than on tech innovation. There's a slight marginal change. The biggest change, however, is that the US no longer seems to rely on India as a champion of regional order. The US now seems uninterested in that. It's got bigger fish to fry. Per its NSS and NDS, American priorities, strategic priorities, are now the homeland, the Western Hemisphere, and maybe China. That's still an open question. According to those documents, China remains a priority, but in practice, the US policy has not really borne that out. But certainly what we can say is that the maintenance of a status quoist order in the Indo-Pacific is no longer a priority for the US. So let me conclude then with what this means for the region. Next slide, please. As I alluded to before, this evolution that we've seen from strategic altruism to whatever the heck we want to call this Trump policy means that the relationship is now narrower, right? If you recall, there was a great PR video that the former US ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, did, where it was a very slick sort of video for YouTube, where he said something like the US-India relationship reaches from the seabed to the stars, or something like that, or the stars to the seabed, right? It was like this idea of this all-encompassing relationship. That's a thing of the past. Now it's a much narrower relationship where, again, the strategic partnership is at the core. Secondly, I think this means that both countries have uh, 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 higher priorities closer to home, or not necessarily closer to home, but higher priorities. For India, certainly they are closer to home. For the US, they're sometimes very far from home on the other side of the planet. But nevertheless, they are higher priorities that detract, that drain from, that take resources away from collective action for the preservation of order and deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Right? That's ultimately what this means. Each country, India and the US, has more urgent problems that it feels the need to address, that takes away from their capacity to act in concert with each other through mechanisms like the Quad, for example. I still believe that the Quad is not only not dead, but has an opportunity for a renaissance and a rebirth in a different form this year. But that rebirth in a different form will be much more security focused, and much less about providing some sort of gauzy, positive alternative vision for regional order like it previously was trying to do, right? Not about international public goods, but about deterrence. And thirdly, what it means is that both the US and India both have their own national reasons for strategic competition with China. And I think that is an unavoidable structural fact. But now that competition is made all the harder, all the more challenging, because there is now political distrust between these putative partners. And because, as I said, with their shrinking strategic horizons, they have concurrency problems. They have other things to do at the same time. The second half of my conclusion. What do we do about this? Next slide, please. We led a project at Stanford last year on what the Quad members can do, right? When I mentioned this idea of a Quad rebirth, whether or not we talk about the Quad as a sort of formal grouping, or whether we just talk about the Quad countries acting bilaterally, trilaterally, or sometimes all together, we argued that the mission of deterring a major war in the Indo-Pacific requires the members of the Quad to do the following things. And the United States and India, as the two largest members of the Quad, this logic still applies to them at a minimum. Number one is the mobilization of their defense industrial bases, because this will be the center of gravity of any future general protracted war, right? If there is a future general protracted war between the US and China, the determinant of which side wins will be that side's ability to mobilize its defense industrial base and everything that goes into that, everything from energy to logistics. Secondly, resilience. And when we talk about resilience here, it's not only military resilience, but it's not only whole of government matter, but a whole of nation matter. So it's everything from resilient airfields all the way down to, continued access to antibiotics. Thirdly, what we're calling the enabling foundations of military cooperation. This is really the sort of service level military to military cooperation that thankfully seems to have continued despite the rupture last year. The strategic partnership that the US and India are forging comes down to things like whether their aircraft can talk to each other on secure comms. And it's those sorts of enabling foundations that will enable military cooperation in the future. And finally, defense coordination. Thus far, much of the work between these countries, when we talk about the Quad countries, but also the bilateral relationship, a lot of it hinges on what authorities the defense establishments of these respective countries have to sign cooperation agreements and to execute on those cooperation agreements. And ultimately, countries like India and the US require ministerial level authorities, or in the Indian case, that may even require PMO approval to have the authorities to execute on these things. Now, this is getting a bit nuts and boltsy, but these are the types of fundamental building blocks that are required, I would argue, to navigate this new era, this new policy. That's all I have. Happy to explore any of these issues in the Q&A.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And the argument, I mean, it came a little late. I wasn't anticipating it, but it's a novel argument. It's a new argument. It's an interesting way of framing the relationship and how it is. I think I haven't come across something like that, with that clarity laying out what's playing out right now, because we are still grappling with it. There are clearly a lot of questions. People, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, or you can just message me. And I also have a lot of questions. So it completely depends on you. If you give us short answers, then we'll pack in more questions. And if you feel like you need to spend some time in a question, then that'll automatically then reduce the number of questions we can ask. I'll start with a question by Vivek Chhabra. He asked a couple of questions, one is that in the India-US relations, how does the Russia play a role? How does that affect US policy, especially India's relationship with Russia, and Pakistan, which is now moving towards US and has a completely new lease of life on its diplomatic role, the historic role that it once used to play. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is yeah. Thank you. And I probably should have addressed this anyway. This is a key part of the strategic partnership between India and the US. Look, for the last few years, the Indian relationship with Russia has, I would argue, not been a deal breaker when there are mature Americans running policy. So, what do I mean by that? During, for example, the Ukraine war, the Biden administration, I think, gave India a lot of latitude, a lot of elbow room in not publicly hectoring India, right? There was clear American disapproval or frustration with India's policy towards Russia. But the Biden administration, as it did with, its concerns on democracy and human rights, etc., the Biden administration was careful to try to keep most of that behind closed doors. Once in a while, it sort of popped up. But generally speaking, the US did not publicly hector India. So when there were, as I said, mature Americans in charge, I think there was an understanding in Washington that the India-Russia relationship has an irreducible element to it. All right, India's hands are obviously tied for many reasons, not only energy but also its path dependence, its dependence on Russia for its military equipment and maintenance and supplies for its military equipment. Americans understand that. Right? American subject matter experts understand that and therefore gave India a bit of latitude on that. However, that's not to say that Americans are pleased with the India-Russia relationship. They're not. And so in some cases, the India-Russia relationship served to impose a ceiling or a limitation on certain forms of US-India relationships, right? And in particular, the sort of totemic example of this is the idea of fifth generation aircraft, right? If India is integrated with Russia or depends upon Russia, uses Russian equipment for certain intelligence-based equipment, and here we're talking about things like S-400, then it is very difficult. This is not a matter of political will, but it is a matter of engineering. It is very difficult for the United States to supply India with, for example, F-35s or other fifth generation equipment that is similarly informatized, right? It's a matter of how those systems connect within the Indian ecosystem. It's a very difficult engineering problem. And so it presented a ceiling to what the US and India could do. And it was a really tough problem because the US understood that the Indians had limited choice, and that, if given the choice, there were many parts of the Indian system that would rather separate away from Russia, but that Indian hands were tied because of history. But there were certain things, therefore, that the US could not do with India. Now, that was then. Now, I started off by saying we need psychologists to understand this, because on the one hand, we went from we will impose the highest tariffs on the world on you because you purchase Russian oil, to we'll give you a 30-day waiver and please do purchase more Russian oil, right? During the Iran war. So there's complete mercurial swings. So how does the Russia relationship affect the US relationship with India? I mean, I think still there are those ceilings that it imposes on the US-India relationship. But ultimately, I don't think it is a deal breaker to any of the things that I outlined in my presentation. On the flip side, look, the Pakistanis are good at diplomacy. The Indians are less good at diplomacy. And what I mean by that is that I should be careful how I phrase this. I have friends in MEA, and they are the pound for pound the best diplomats in the world. But the Pakistanis play a weak hand very well, and India has a lot of potential, a lot of potential leverage that it rarely converts into real leverage. And we saw that post Sindoor, right? The Pakistanis played their weak hand extremely well and have, as you said, dealt their way back into American policy in Asia. Again, I think it's the flip side. I think there are mature Indians who understand that this does not signify a necessary erosion in US policy towards India, right? They understand that this is, again, what happens in the White House when you present the president with a briefcase full of minerals and it looks, showy and glossy. There are ways to play Trump that the Pakistanis have figured out and are happy to exploit, and that the Indians have, for several reasons, chosen not to. And so, again, I don't think that is an impediment to US-India relations. And arguably, if we really believe in dehyphenation, right, then there is nothing to suggest that the US cannot maintain a relationship with Pakistan at the same time that it builds a much more meaningful strategic partnership with India, right? It does not have to be a zero-sum game. So, and I believe in dehyphenation, and I believe that Pakistan has utility for American policymakers, and just because India may have more utility doesn't mean that the US has to turn its back on Pakistan.
So you invoke the idea of psychology of presidents as well, not just Trump, but also Nixon and their personality quirks versus more structural factors that are going on. When you think about this transition from strategic altruism to flexible realism, this transition, is this a Trump transition, or is it, something which is structural that is happening? And like, what are the factors then are driving it? And perhaps, I mean, the big question then is that tomorrow when Trump goes away and next person in the White House, do we expect this to continue? I mean, in a nicer packaging, but but like same logic to continue.
Yeah. So there's okay, so you mentioned, is it structurally driven? Is it psychologically driven by the man? There's one other level of analysis, which is political, right? Which is that in the US, uh, regrettably, unfortunately, it has become politically salient, politically beneficial to promote or to frame policies in ways that are America first or give clear benefits, clear immediate benefits to the US, right? Previously, there was no political hay to be made by doing this. Now there is a there is a strain of thinking in American politics that suggests that it is not America's place to lead globalization, to be the breadbasket of the world, to organize a global anti-communist coalition as it was in the Cold War, right? Back in those days, there was glory to be had in leading the free world. Now it is politically toxic to do that, to provide international public goods. So I think there's a political dimension to it as well. Now, when you ask about flexible realism, look, the NSS is the product of a lengthy, albeit imperfect, interagency process, right? This is not an outcome of psychology. The outcome of psychology is when you do a control F to find the word Trump, you see that many times because egos have to be, stroked, I should say. So there's that sort of psychological appeal that is required. They have to throw in the word Trump many times. They have to badmouth Biden many times and Obama. But ultimately, most of the ideas behind flexible realism are structurally founded, right? They are ideas that have roots in American strategic thinking as well. There has always been a strain of American strategic thinking, or always meaning at least since the end of the Cold War. There has been a strain of American strategic thinking that argues for retrenchment, or some people used to call it, I forget now, offshore balancing, selective engagement, or it comes in different, nuances, but essentially it talks about the US retrenching to varying degrees from its leadership role in the world. So that has always been there, and I see flexible realism as the most extreme application of that thus far. That's not to say it won't get more extreme, but thus far, this is the most extreme application of that. But we saw it even in Trump 1, right? When the US walked away from TPP, right? When Obama negotiated TPP as, again, as an artifact of American leadership in international institutions and American leadership in constructing an architecture of order in the Indo-Pacific. And then not only did Trump walk away from it, but who else walked away from it? The Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, walked away from TPP as well, right? So this is what I mean by it's become politically toxic to do those things these days. So unfortunately, sorry, long-winded answer. Unfortunately, I don't think this is just an idiosyncratic Trump thing. This speaks to an undercurrent that is unhelpful for the world, an undercurrent in American politics that is hostile to a large and sort of altruistic American role in the world.
I like that answer. I mean, it is, which actually leads me to another question, which is, to what degree is that a strategic partnership, right? If you take away the maintenance of regional order, if you take away the underlying logic of counterbalancing China, if you say basically, see, we're going to come together, work where we can.
Yep.
Sometimes we'll bully you into doing things that we want, right?
Yep.
I mean, sometimes
Yep.
you will get away, like be resisted and all that, right? Like And I mean, some people might argue that this is not all too different from what has happened in the last 20 years either. But I mean, that setting that aside, but there was at least a veneer, there was an expectation of the
Right.
future. If you take that
Right.
away,
Right.
is this just a death of the strategic partnership?
No, no, certainly not. I don't think so. I think the strategic partnership, as I said, has powerful structural reasons to endure um, on both sides. Both sides have structural incentives for it to endure. Um, but I guess that the key difference is that whereas previously under strategic altruism, there was how do you say this? Something exceptional, something unique about the US-India relationship or about the US approach to India as compared with the US approach to other countries. There was something different about how it approached India. That is no longer the case. India is no longer special. It used to be that for years and years, for decades, every time there was an official either speech or official publication like an NSS or NDS, there used to be this sort of requirement, this unwritten requirement that people had to say that India was the linchpin of American policy, was the most consequential country for the 20th century or 21st century. Had to sort of suggest that there was something uniquely important about the US-India partnership. I think that is now different. There is nothing uniquely important about it. It is a strategic partnership now among many. And it will, under the Trump administration, it will wax and wane. Um, again, I don't, just to be 100% clear on this, I don't agree with that, but I think that is where we see US policy today.
Very very interesting. And also, um, when we started this conversation, were like, given your earlier writings, I wasn't expecting this is, I mean, this is a sign of true analyst that you're basically explaining what is happening, not really advocating for one outcome or another. But it is very
Yeah.
interesting that where this conversation has gone. Um, what
I'm not happy
about
about it.
all,
Let me just say,
yeah.
I'm not happy about any of this.
What about the possibility of G2? How does that affect this partnership, or whatever is the remnant or new avatar of this partnership, given an outcome in which United States and China essentially either come to terms in terms of saying that we are going to have some kind of a hierarchy and we both agree to it, or they say that you have spheres of influence that we're going to divide up, or something or the other, right? Uh,
Yeah.
if you end up in that kind of a situation, then how does that have implications on India-US partnership?
Look, um, so first of all, let's just clarify. When people use the term G2 as a shorthand, it's usually meant to refer to some sort of condominium between the US and China to share power and to share order maintenance responsibilities in the Indo-Pacific, right? This idea that the US and China acknowledge each other as co-leaders of this region. Um, I don't think that's going to happen, in large part because the US doesn't want to do that anymore. And I don't think it wants to then sort of take the next step and acknowledge another country as a co-leader. Because that implies, again, this sort of noblesse oblige, this idea of the US as a leader, as a hegemon, as a provider of international public goods, which I think is anathema these days. Um, but having said that, so it's not going to be quite that sort of Obama era notion of a G2. But having said that, that doesn't mean that Trump will necessarily always seek to counterbalance or contain China or compete with China. I think it is entirely within the realm of possibility that Trump uh, uh, not out of, again, the sense of co-leadership, but Trump out of a sense of um, who knows what. Again, the psychology is imponderable, but out of a sense of not wanting to take on a big challenge, cuts a deal with China. I think that is eminently plausible. I'm not a China expert, and I don't watch the US policy towards China very closely, but I think it's entirely plausible that China can construct for Trump a bargain that is an offer that is too good to pass up. That involves, for example, avoiding a costly World War III, that somehow provides assurances to Trump that matter to Trump, right? The things that matter to Trump are different to the things that have traditionally mattered to American foreign policy architects. American foreign policy architects, again, remember, per my presentation, have concerned themselves with things like maintaining a balance of power on the Eurasian landmass. That does not matter. What matters now is that, well, I don't want to be too cynical, but ultimately things like the Trump family gets richer, that Trump's corporate elite allies get richer, that America does not embroil itself in costly, lengthy wars. I think these are things that matter to Trump. And if China can construct for him an enticing deal that ticks those boxes and gets for itself, for Zhongnanhai, what it desires, right? Power and primacy in the first island chain. I think that's plausible. Where does that leave India? Well, not in a good place, right? Um, the phrase is that, China always talks about a multipolar world order, and Jaishankar always has to say, hang on a second, but it's not multipolar world, it's multipolar Asia, right? If China and the US cut a deal, the risk is that Asia becomes unipolar, that China then has a clearer path to dominating Asia, which includes India. I think it is within India's interests, and I think the Indian establishment clearly understands this, that it is within India's interests to work with the US to prevent Chinese hegemony in East Asia, which would become Chinese hegemony of Asia. India cannot compete with the dominant China.
There's an interesting question anonymously posted, which is actually the flip side of what you were talking about, contingency. In the event of a China-India war, what role would US play? What role it imagined it would have played before the strategic altruism went away, and now?
Yeah, in the before times. Look, the answer to both, right, before or after, it largely depends on Delhi, I think. It largely depends on Delhi, not Washington. And what I mean by this is, okay, so first of all, when we talk about an India-China war, I'm imagining a border war. I'm not imagining a war in the Indian Ocean. I'm imagining a war in the Himalayas, a very limited, bounded conflict in the Himalayas. In that case, my sort of baseline assessment, my sort of the point of departure is that the US would offer to provide a bunch of supporting assistance. And that primarily means things like ISR support, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance support of what the Chinese are doing. Perhaps some resupply of munitions or platforms that India requires, that India already uses of US type. So there's not a lot that India has that is US origin, but things like, for example, artillery guns, transport aircraft, drones, certainly. Those are the sorts of things that India uses that are of US origin, that it would probably require resupply of, and that the US would, all things being equal, nominally be willing to resupply India with. We're obviously never, just to be clear on this, We're obviously never going to see US boots on the ground. So if we're talking about that sort of role of the US, we're not going to see that. We're obviously not going to see the US try and do any sort of diversionary nonsense in the first island chain. None of that, right? The sort of baseline assessment is behind the scenes support to support Indian warfighters. That's the baseline assessment. And I think probably if it were to occur in a Trump administration, I don't see a clear reason why the US would deviate from that, right? Again, as I started off by saying, however, a lot of this really depends not on what Washington wants, but on what Delhi wants. And there is politics that come into play. We saw that in during the 2020 crisis, uh, Washington offered and India accepted this type of behind the scenes support, ISR and resupply, but it was not publicly acknowledged until long after the fact. Right? Both sides, the Indians did not want to acknowledge it publicly, and the US respected that and did not leak it. And I suspect, and again, um, I uh, uh, a lot of it will depend on what is politically palatable to Delhi. Um, um, but Delhi now runs the risk of having a Trump administration that is unreliable in terms of sort of message discipline. So Delhi can say all at once about, hey, we would appreciate this form of support, but we would also appreciate if you didn't mention it publicly. There is no longer any assurance that those wishes will be respected as they once were.
It's interesting that you talk about the possibility of US support during that kind of conflict. I mean, it's not all that different from what happened in 1962. I mean, which is a non-alignment era, right? And this is a strategic partnership era. It's not like the needle has moved all that much on that front.
Yeah,
But we
yeah,
have a few more questions coming in a little late,
sure.
and but I think they are interesting, and we can perhaps go a little over time to
Yeah.
accommodate them. So
Or
I have
I'll do a
a
lightning round. I'll be less um I'll ramble less.
I have a question from our colleague, my colleague Ivan. Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. In some ways, you seem to argue that US expectations of India were not sufficiently satisfied at present, as the payoff was always in the distant future, and Washington ran out of patience under Trump, and then it shifted its goals. Were there such unmet expectations shifting goals on the Indian side too? Was it a one-sided reframing of the relationship, or both sides actually began to rethink it?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yeah, look, I mean, my homework assignment was what does the US want out of India? And certainly there are frustrations on the other side as well, right? But I don't think those frustrations are of the same type. Let me think this through. So one sort of yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Okay. So whereas on the US side, the frustration was, uh, like the Romans, what have they done for us lately, right? And there was scant answer to that. There was not a lot that you could answer that the Indians had done for the US, quote unquote. On the Indian side, I think the concern was a little bit different. Not what has the US done for us lately? What has the US offered us lately? I suspect on the Indian side, the concern, and this is a function of the power asymmetry, is more about suspicion and concern of US coercion of India, right? And I don't mean sort of uh, hard-edged coercion in the same way that China coerces India, but I mean a suspicion that dependence upon the US opens India up to a vulnerability that could at some point in the future be used against India, right? So I don't think there was a sense necessarily that, for example, under the Biden administration, I don't think that India felt often coerced, right? There was the sort of perennial issue of non-government American institutions sort of being mean to India, right? Okay, fine, but that's for a start, non-government institutions. or even when the State Department issues its religious freedom report, I mean, it's a trivial, minor, secondary issue, right? So I don't think there was any serious concern that the US would um, contemporaneously coerce India. The concern more was that any vulnerability to any power, including the US, um, a correction, any dependence on any power creates a vulnerability for India. And it just so happens that India's greatest dependence, or certainly its most rapidly growing dependencies, were upon the US, which creates the most rapidly growing vulnerabilities for India. So I think the expectations or concerns were there on the Indian side, but they were of a different nature. I mean, it was pretty clear that the US provided a lot to India, which is why Jaishankar and the current dispensation are very clear, have been very clear that the partnership with the US is so critical for Indian power. If the US was not providing anything to India, then they would not be investing so much in the relationship with the US. Clearly, the expectation, clearly the understanding is that the US does provide a lot to India that is useful for India's own power accretion. But I think it's the flip side that was a greater concern to India.
Um, there's a follow-up on the idea that you were talking about the possibility of a deal being cut between China and the United States, and China ending up in a unipolar Asia situation, which is, would a unipolar Asia mean, what would it mean for, would it mean degradation of US-Japan treaties? Which I imagine the question is basically also pushing the idea that, not just India, US, which is a weak relationship, but, the old allies of United States, where do they end up in a deal of this sort?
Yeah,
Not just
I
Japan,
mean,
but Korea, Philippines.
yeah, Australia, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you are to visit Australia, if you are to visit Canberra and you go to Defence Headquarters in Canberra, you will see it's a set of buildings that are arrayed around a square called Blamey Square, and at the center of Blamey Square is a monument, an obelisk, a very tall obelisk, and sitting on top of that obelisk is an eagle. That obelisk is a monument to the essentially to the US alliance. All right. It is literally at the center of Australian defense, right? The US alliance. So if we were to see that sort of eventuality of the US cutting a deal, either implicitly or explicitly with China, then it's not just Japan, it's also Australia, it's also Korea. All of these treaty partners of the US suddenly have lost the cornerstone of their defense establishment, of their strategic policy. It matters probably the most to Japan and Australia, but also many other countries. Um, I mean, what happens then? I mean, I've been in exercises in TTXs where literally the very next step that Japan undertakes is nuclearization, right? I mean, what else is there? It's not so much, I don't know what you mean by degradation of the treaty, but it does essentially mean that the US becomes no longer the uh, the core element that all of defense policy depends upon. And so then these countries have to depend upon themselves and depend upon each other. So we've already seen, let me sort of change the premise a little bit. Forget the deal, forget a unipolar Asia. If we just talk about the actually existing Trump administration thus far, we have already seen its sort of uncertainty and equivocation over the Indo-Pacific result in countries like Japan and Australia tightening their connection, and indeed Japan and India tightening their connection. Right? So it's no longer that the US is the central node that brings these partners together. It's that these partners are now forging their own relationships with each other, acknowledging that they indeed have structural common interests, and are perhaps more dependable than a mercurial US is.
I am really tempted to sneak in one more question, and I'm just gonna do it, which is, let me put you, let me put lay out an alternative explanation of
Yeah.
the strategic partnership and how it played out,
Yeah.
which is that one interesting aspect of the last 20-25 years of the strategic partnership is how much it keeps getting sidetracked by what Silicon Valley calls side quests, right? That rather than talking about actually about Indo-Pacific or China, it's about, in Bush era, it was about the civil nuclear liability, or it was about the defense purchases from India, or about Iran and the oil purchases from Iran, or oil purchases from Russia, or all sorts of other things, right? What would you say to a very cynical reading, which is essentially that strategic partnership is a nice overlay for basically bringing India in and getting India to be pushed on other fronts, like opening up its markets, following American sanctions regime on all parts of the world, like aligning India to do a lot of other things, which have nothing to do with China, which have nothing to do with
Mm.
Indo-Pacific, but basically
Mm.
pushing India, right? Like, because if you are not in a completely acrimonious or a semi-acrimonious relationship that you existed in before 1990s, then you can basically, as a friend, perhaps you can influence the behavior much more easily. So perhaps it
Yeah.
was never about, China, or it was only partially about China, which is a very cynical way of reading it. But what do you think about that?
Mate, I don't see why it being about China is not cynical, right? I mean, I think what you're saying, it sort of makes sense, except then Telus would be right in saying it's a bad bet because there's a lot of concessions that the Americans are giving for not a lot of benefit. If you're talking about all this other rubbish, like Iran sanctions or whatever, or voting behavior in this UN body or that UN body, none of that means anything compared to the challenge posed by China, right? So if you were to make the cynical argument, I think it carries a lot more traction if you say that um, that strategic altruism was a ruse, was a trick to get India to uh, act more firmly against China. That to me is a much more defensible, cynical argument because that actually does yield dividends for American grand strategy as it has been traditionally understood for decades. Um, um, uh, Now, I don't think that's true, again, because I think if you look at the two sides of the ledger, I do think that India gained more out of this relationship than the US gained, right? I think Indian power has benefited much more from the US partnership than American deterrence policy has gained from the India partnership, right? So I think India has actually made out like a bandit out of this partnership. Indian power has. Um, and so that's why I don't think that cynical argument is correct because India has benefited from it. Um, but I think if anything, I think the the again the concern of India could be if you had to put a cynical spin on it, the concern of India should be the concern that Jaishankar has expressed that listen, as we become more dependent or interdependent with the United States, we become more vulnerable to the whims of a mercurial declining empire. And you never know, that may one day prove to be much more consequential than a few cents of additional cost on petroleum, and it may wind up dragging us into a war with China. That to me would be a much more compelling cynical argument. I don't think that's quite right, but I think that's where the real danger would lie for India.
This has been fantastic. I learned a lot, and this is a very interesting way of unpacking what has been going on right now and also giving it a historical twist. And clearly, because of the interesting questions that were coming up, you can see that it provoked a lot of thoughts. Thank you to Arjun for joining us and giving us this very interesting presentation. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Tanuja for helping out, stepping in with the last moment and helping us out technically on this. And we'll see you again next month. We are still finalizing exactly which event we will do, but for India-Asia series next month, we'll most likely do on India and Burma relations, India and Myanmar relations. See you next month. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks very much, Sandeep. Thanks, everyone.